Hey everybody, welcome. Today we will be talking about the phylum Porifera, which is sponges, our very first animal group that we're going to talk about for zoology. So here's an example of a Caribbean demo sponge. Um, Most people, when they think of sponges, they don't think of animals. They're very simple, um, but they are actually very closely related to the first animals that we ever see in the fossil record. So some basic characteristics of sponges. Sponges are multicellular. They're heterotrophs. Their cells don't have any cell walls. They do have a few specialized cells that we'll be talking about in the notes, but they don't have any germ layers, so there's no gastrulation, there's no gut. But if you remember the characteristics of being an animal, right? Being an animal means you have to be eukaryotic, heterotrophic, no cell walls. They fit all of those categories. General features, sponges are sessile, which means they're immobile. They don't move on their own. They are filter feeders. The word porphyria means pore bearing, right? They have these little holes in their body where they bring in water. Um, they have what are called choanocytes, which are basically specialized cells to help move water into and out of the sponge and help them filter. And then there are actually approximately 15,000 different species of sponges. Well, most are marine, which means they live in salt water. There are a few that live in brackish water, which is a mixture of salt and fresh water, and then 150 freshwater species of sponges. Some vocab words that you'll need to know for the unit and things that'll come up over and over again. So the choanocyte is the collar cell. It's basically the sponge's digestive system. It's how it filters out particles in the water and gets its food. I'll show you a picture of that a little bit later. The archaeocytes play a role in nutrient transport and sexual reproduction, but they also basically act as a sponge's stem cell. They can turn into most of the sponge's body cells. And then spicules are stiffened rods or spikes made of either calcium carbonate, so similar to like a shell, or silica, which is like glass, and mainly used for defense and protection. Sponges have no circulatory system, no respiratory system, and no excretory system. Sponges are also asymmetrical, so they have an irregular shape for their whole body. They might have like a little tube on their body that might look like radially symmetrical or bilaterally symmetrical, but if you look at its whole body, it's usually asymmetrical. This is the choanocyte. Knowing how this works is pretty key. So you look at the cell, right? It has a nucleus. It's got cytoplasm and all of that. Um, but attached to this cell is what's known as a flagellum, which is this little thing that sticks out of it. And the flagellum beats. And when it beats, it creates a water current. And what happens is the water current forces like little food particles to get trapped in this like little surrounding area of the sponge, in this like little mesh area. Then the cell can take in those trapped food particles, put it in a food vacuole, and transfer that into its body. So that's how it gets its food, right? It filters out water with these choanocytes. Um, Sponge obviously doesn't have any bones. Its body can either be fibrous, like a soft, squishy sponge, or rigid, like some of the calcium or glass sponge I'll show you. Um, If it is more of a rigid skeleton, most of its body is spicules. And if it's more of a fiber skeleton, most of its body is spongin. And sponge classification is based usually on the composition and the shape of spicules. Here's just a few examples of the different. structural structures that spicules can take. What I think of when I think of this is I think of snowflakes and how they all have different shapes and different patterns that they can take. Same with the spicules. And then this is the spongin, which you can see is more of a soft fibrous material. So sponges first show up in the fossil record in the early Cambrian period. If you remember Earth's history, the Cambrian explosion is where you get this huge diversity of animal life. That's when we first start to see sponges. Right now, there are three living classes of sponges. You can see the names here. I'll explain in a minute. Um, right now, we know that there are three living classes of sponges: Calcarea, Hexatinalidia, and Demosponge. And you don't need to know the full names here, just kind of how they're different. So the Calcarea sponges are basically sponges that are made of calcium carbonate. Demo sponges are the more like soft fiber sponges you think of. Um, and then finally we have glass sponges, whose most of their body is made of glass spicules. So a few more words to throw out there. Um, so there are incurrent and excurrent holes for where water comes into and leaves a sponge. And so water comes in through ostia. I remember that is ostia has an I, um, and in starts with an I. And then osculum is just the opposite, right? So osculum is where water leaves the sponges. Um, the little ostia or the incurrent pores average about 50 nanometers in size, and they're surrounded by porocytes. Porocytes regulate the amount of water that passes in or out of the sponge. So those can get bigger or smaller depending on how big the porocytes make the hole. And then inside the body, most water is um, directed past the choanocytes where all the food particles are collected. In sponges, there are three different types of canal systems that they can have. Um, the canal system is basically how water passes through the sponge. So the most simple form is called an asconoid sponge. Um, it's very simple in terms of its body plan. It's small, it's tube shaped. Water enters into a large cavity, which the large cavity in the center of a sponge is called a spongiocele, where basically that cavity is lined with choanocytes. Um, Let me show you. So that's this one right here. Um, so again, water just comes into the sponge through the ostia, the little holes in the side. Um, it goes into the middle cavity of the sponge, called the spongiocele. Water passes through. Um, the food material is filtered out, and then water leaves to the top of the osculum. That's different than a synconoid sponge. Synconoid sponges are a little bit more complex. They're kind of like the medium level of complexity, where instead of water just going into the simple sponge seal, what happens is there are these tiny little canals inside of the sponge to increase the surface area. And so that's what we see in this example here and the picture off to the right, where you still have all the same like ostia and osculum. There's still the spongiocele in the middle, but within the walls of the spongiocele, there are these little kind of canals or tunnels where the water can go into to increase the surface area, increase the amount of water that can be filtered by the sponge. And it's inside of these little canals that you have the choanocytes, which are the things that filter out the water. Um, Finally, we have the leuconoid sponges. The leuconoid sponges are the most complex, and um, they're also the sponges that are the most common, and that's because these are the most efficient in filtering out water. Instead of just having like the little canals, they also have chambers within the canals. Um, so an average leuconoid sponge can filter up to 1,500 liters of water per day. And that's this example here, where you still have the ostia, and then there's little chambers, but inside those little chambers are even smaller little chambers lined with choanocytes, right? So you're increasing the surface area where the sponges can absorb water. And here's an example of an orange demo sponge, which is also a leuconoid. All right, so next we're going to discuss reproduction and regeneration in sponges. So we'll start with regeneration. Sponges have the ability to regenerate any lost parts of their body and repair injuries. That happens through the archaeocytes. Archaeocytes, again, the specialized sponge cell that acts as their stem cell. Um, and regeneration can also be one of the means of asexual reproduction, right? So sponges have the ability to produce both asexually and sexually. Um, Asexually, it can be done by budding, where they can grow an external bud. It breaks off at a certain size and it grows into a copy of that original sponge. But they can also make internal buds too, called gemmules. Um, a gemmule is a vocab word, but a gemmule is basically an internal bud released by the sponge in super extreme conditions. Um, and so what happens, here's the gemmule. The gemmule is just basically a package of archaeocytes, again, the sponge stem cell, surrounded by spicules to protect them. And so in harsh conditions, or if the sponge feels like it might be dying, what it does is it releases these gemmules to go to a different part of the water and hopefully still survive. But sponges also have the ability to reproduce sexually. Most are monoecious, which means they have both sexes in the same body, so both male and female parts. So what happens is in some sponges, one sponge will say release the sperm, which can go to travel to another sponge. The sponge then brings in the sperm through its pores, um, provides it with nutrients, and develop or fertilizes it with its own eggs. Um, if this happens, so if you have a larvae formed through sexual reproduction, um, that larvae is actually free swimming, and that's the only part of the sponge's life cycle where there is an actual free swimming larvae, and that's called a parenchyma, and that's what you can see here. It's this little ciliated larvae here off to the side where it eventually attaches to some substrate, so some part of the ocean floor, and develops into its own sponge. Sponges are classified again into the three different classes we talked about: bony sponges, glass sponges, and demo sponges, which are the more softer sponges. You can just see a couple examples here. Here are the bony sponges, um, right here. Here are the glass sponges and the demo sponges. And then you can see real pictures here as we go through. Last little bit. So like there are actually a lot of uses for sponges in the animal kingdom. Um, One that I kind of find funny is that dolphins will attach a sponge to its nose or to their noses, and then search for food in the sand. So they'll like break off pieces of the sponge, attach it to its nose, and then they can dig through the sand um, without like injuring their nose. Humans obviously have commercial uses for sponges. You can go to like Bed Bath and Beyond and buy a once living natural bath sponge. That's different than the sponge you have in your kitchen, which you use to wash dishes. Those sponges are mainly made of cellulose fibers, and those were never living. Um, Sponges also have some medicinal purposes. There's antimicrobial components found in sponges that have been used to develop things like industrial cleaners, or medicines and things like that. Um, Hopefully, you learned a little bit about sponges, and it was interesting. Thank you for watching.